Welcome back to the Arreoblue Data Podcast, where we talk all things data. In today's episode, we're going to be going through and discussing all things AI and really just focusing in on responsible AI, ethical AI, and all things that come around it. We'll be talking about things like what does that actually mean, and going through some examples of how that can be used. I'm joined today in the podcast studio by Kailani from Microsoft. Hi, Kailani. Great. Thank you for joining us.
Hi.
I guess before we kind of jump in, it'd be great just to introduce yourself to our listeners and what your role is there at Microsoft.
Yeah, of course. So my name is Kailani. I'm an AI cloud solution architect at Microsoft, based here in the UK, and I'm also part of the local Responsible AI Center of Excellence, which is basically a local volunteer group of people who want to drive the Responsible AI agenda forwards here at Microsoft UK.
Amazing. I can imagine you work on all sorts of different projects there.
Yeah, definitely. Across industry, also across of customer size. So from enterprise to major to small, medium business customers.
Amazing. Yeah. That's just a huge grasp of Microsoft's customers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess let's start there. I mean, what sort of projects have you kind of worked on? Like, what's the kind of
So as an AI cloud solution architect, I only work on AI use cases with our customers, but specifically to Responsible AI, we only get called in when customers have a specific concern or when it falls in our sensitive use case category. So if we deem a use case to be of higher risk, or they're just things that people are unsure of, or it falls into like a gray area, then we go more into detail in terms of what can be done to safeguard it.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions as we go through some of the topics in today's session, but cool. And I guess before we kind of jump in, obviously Microsoft has Responsible AI, and we're going to kind of go through that in one of the topics, but how have you seen that played out, and have you seen that evolve and change whilst your time at Microsoft?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this year specifically, it just kind of exploded, I feel. I've been involved in Responsible AI for about 2 years now. But only this year I've been really busy, where we've had more tools being added to it. We've had more customer requests. And also now it's in all the marketing. So when Satya goes onto the stage and talks about the era of AI, he always mentions Responsible AI, whereas in previous conferences it wasn't mentioned as much. So this year, definitely, it's completely exploded.
Yeah, so you're at the spearhead of like the innovation, I guess, from Microsoft.
Definitely.
Exciting times there. Cool. So I guess one of the first topics that we kind of jump in there is just understanding what responsible AI means. So obviously some of our listeners might have never touched AI. They don't even know what responsible AI means. So can you just give us a bit of an introduction as to what responsible AI and ethical AI means? And then we'll kind of jump into what Microsoft thinks of that.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say responsible AI and ethical AI often gets used interchangeably, but it's actually very different. Ethical AI is more in terms of how AI is used in what sort of scenario and what use case. There are some things that one person might deem as ethical and another person as unethical, and that's very much based on your own personal perspective and your personal boundary of what's ethical is. Whereas responsible AI is more on safeguarding the AI application and making sure it is behaving in a safe and responsible manner. And that's not really a special add-on to AI applications or use cases. It's just part of the whole package, really.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sure back in the day when Clippy was created, I don't think that was even thinking about responsible and AI. So have you seen the tools evolve over time to kind of wrap around this, or?
The AI tools?
Yeah.
Definitely. I think now we have way stronger AI models. If you think about the Azure OpenAI model, for example, it has built-in safety, such as the content filtering, whereas all of our other AI services and products that we had before didn't have it as an add-on. You'd have to add it on yourself. So with machine learning, for example, if you had to build a model, it was your own choice whether you wanted to add safety or like explainability or something on top of it. Whereas now with the tooling we create, we make it part of the packaging. So with Azure OpenAI, it has the content filtering, for example.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And I guess obviously Microsoft has some AI principles that it kind of instills on its customers. Could you share a bit about what that means and how, how customers can leverage those?
Yeah, definitely. So the Microsoft AI principles were created years and years ago. And what it really does is just to create an internal framework and standard that we operate to ourselves for internal AI use cases and external AI use cases. But it also helps other customers understand how they should go around it, because we typically look at ourselves first and then we market something externally. So I think we internally also first had to think about how do we want to govern it internally, or what are our own responsibility pillars, what's our own standard, or how do we define our gray zone, which AI use cases we approve or reject because it's too risky for us. So in terms of the principles, I think these are quite generic. And if you look at some of the frameworks that are coming out now, the EU AI Act, or even the HMG framework, like Her Majesty's government, they put out a generative AI framework.
Mm-hmm.
And in the generative AI framework, they basically also outline similar principles and a different framework that looks as people processing technology. And when you look at our internal principles and framework, it's actually very similar.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nice and generic that it fits in with most of the regulations that are currently out. And most customers will be able to find them quite useful, so they're highly customizable, I find.
Nice, yeah, because I guess with every AI project, there's probably certain principles that apply more than others, but...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they're so generic, so you can kind of go a bit deeper into one than another. So just in terms of transparency, let's say, there are some AI use cases where you want the transparency more in terms of maybe explainability, like why is it doing what it's doing? Why did it come to that decision? Which is not always that important, depending on what you're using it for. If you're just using a speech to text, you don't really need to know why or how it's done that. It's just like you're happy the way that it's doing it. But if you have a machine learning model that will either accept or reject immigration status to a country, you really want to know how it came to those decisions, and you want that transparency and that explainability. So it's very much on a sliding scale in terms of how, not how important responsible AI is, but how deep you have to go into it.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I guess there's a certain level of these are principles, but how much and how strict you enforce it, I guess, depends on the use case of what you're trying to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And even with the EU AI Act, you can see it's more like a risk framework where it's not just one standardized approach for all AI use cases have to fall in this category. It's very much on, well, what industry are you in? What are you trying to do with it? How risky of a use case is it? And depending on that, you need to do different things. And this is very similar with our principles. You really have to see what you're doing in your use case and then apply them accordingly. There's no one size fits all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, that would be the holy grail, but unfortunately, not something that's possible. I guess obviously the principles are great as like best practices to set out. I mean, it'd be good just to obviously understand some of our people listening that haven't done an AI project. They are maybe thinking about it. I guess what are the key challenges they might face in terms of ethical challenges, and that these principles try to sort of resolve, I guess.
Yeah, I think not enough people, not enough companies, but also just data scientists do a proper impact assessment of what they're trying to achieve and identify the correct risks and think about ways to mitigate them. They're so maybe focused on accuracy and performance and these other metrics, and they don't do that much thinking around, well, who might this impact in terms of the actual end users, and what are some of the risks that are associated with it. And there's a lack of skills probably around AI safety and AI governance. Like, what are the tooling on the market at the moment that you can use to safeguard your AI application? How would you go about this? Or how do you effectively red team, for example? I think it's something and a skill that not many people have, and not many companies are currently training their staff on.
Yeah, because, well, I mean, a lot of companies that in the world there they probably don't have an AI team. You know, they might just have a data team, or and again, like the challenges that they might face without that, or potentially run into those issues as they start building out those use cases. We've at Arreoblue, we've got a bit of an AI responsible AI framework that kind of focuses on what you've mentioned. You know, there's 4 pillars really. Is like starting pillar being data governance, which obviously is always a key factor in any data and AI project. But we've now built out these other 3 pillars, which are AI safety, AI ethics, and AI governance. And some of those things that you mentioned of having an exec that's linked to that, or any bias and testing and impact testing on what that kind of thing might do. So yeah, it's interesting to hear that you're seeing that as well, and that links in with that side.
Yeah, I love how data governance is actually part of your framework. It's the first time I've heard about your framework that you have, and I kind of wish it was part of our one as well. Not many people see the correlation between data governance and responsible AI, but you really need to know where your data is sitting and who has access to it and what's inside of it. And most companies don't know this. They don't have good data governance in place. And especially when you think about fine-tuning a model, to do that, you have to give it additional data. And that additional data has to be of high quality, but it also has to be safe. And if you don't have good data governance, how are you going to go and fine-tune your models and be sure you're not introducing bias or unsafe material? You just wouldn't know.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. Again, it's like knowing what your model is learning off of, right? Again, we can talk about some customer examples, but I'd say there's a particular cloud vendor with the name that rhymes with Amazon that got in trouble for a similar sort of thing, where its models were learning off of their CVs for a recruitment process, but all of their CVs were male because it's quite a male-dominated industry. And so it would actually reject female CVs because it thought that was the right way it was learning. So again, just things like that, and just understanding the impact that might have, and the data, having a good understanding of what the data was in there in the first place might have helped resolve
Absolutely.
that.
And there's so many tools available nowadays that help you actually identify your bias in these systems. So for example, with your example, you would actually be able to just look at the data and look at the output and identify these biases and see, oh yeah, actually, it's like more biased towards males than females. And these toolings, many people aren't aware that we currently have them. And if you're not aware that we have them, they will most likely not actually use them. So yeah.
I mean, I can imagine there's a lot of tools and a lot of processes and policies. Recently went to an event called AI in Accountancy, and some really interesting things that I could hear a lot of the senior leaders talking about in terms of policies. And how do you think companies approach that aspect, and like best, I guess, police or measure how these things are working?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies are trying to figure out what their own internal governance or just AI processes should look like, and how they're going to go about this, and also who should be doing this. Like, what type of role internally should take the accountability to actually look over it? Is it the data scientist? Is it the legal department? Is it the CIO, CSO, whoever it may be? So even deciding on the right person to take this upon themselves is like the first hard step. So often when we do these customer meetings, they just invite everyone. It's like a huge meeting, like 30 people from the customer, and from loads of different departments that are not necessarily technical. A lot of times they bring lawyers as well.
Well,
yeah, because
definitely needed, right?
yeah, because they're just trying to figure out like where does it fit internally. And yeah, so they're trying to establish their own internal policies on how they go about these things. And they're trying to take inspiration from other companies. But realistically, not that many companies are at that stage yet where they've actually thought about it or have the perfect thing in place. So there's limited examples to take inspirations from. So we're all on the same journey together, really.
Yeah, that constant evolution, I guess, which is yeah, we're all on the same bus trying to find out how to do it. I mean, it's really interesting as you say that, because sometimes these AI projects do just land on like a CIO or CDO's desk as like that we need to do something in order to go back to the markets and say we've got an AI project in motion, right? So they do rely on partners like Arreoblue and also vendors like Microsoft and so forth to kind of help with that. What's the kind of best some of the projects that you've worked on, what have been the best, like the symptoms, or I guess maybe not symptoms. What's the? Let me restart that. The projects that you've been working on, what have been the best kind of success stories? The best projects had this many people or this sort of team. They engaged these vendors. What kind of behaviors did they example?
I've not worked on a project like this myself, but I've seen customers coming to us where they just want to tell us what they're currently doing and just get our opinion. And they've had a really good process in place. So it was a healthcare customer, and obviously they have a lot of like other regulations. It's like a heavily regulated industry, things that they need to worry about. And because they're a healthcare industry, they just assume that every AI use case is instantly high risk because they're in a very high risk sort of industry. And they have already had like an internal governance process on how do they accept and reject AI use cases. How do they keep a good oversight of the different AI use cases in their company? And also, they had a process on how to identify the correct models and who they work with in terms of vendors or partners, and if maybe they align to their own internal response by standard. So, do they have the right skills in place? Like looking at partners, for example, do they have the right skills in place? Are there maybe certain certifications that they were looking for? Or have they had past projects where they had to deal with a high risk situation, and how did they deal with it? And in terms of vendors, I think it's all about transparency. So a lot of other cloud operators, they don't have transparent documents around how their AI is being built. And a lot of the other large language model providers don't have good enough documentation that explains how they're safeguarding the model at the model layer. How did they go about training it? What data did they use? Is there identified bias? Have they even thought about it? So there are all these different questions, part of their like due diligence process that they will go through. And it was really impressive to see because they almost have an internal checklist of things that they are going to ask a certain partner or a certain vendor beforehand. So they really knew what they were looking out for, and they had their own standards. So they came very prepared, whereas some other customers haven't thought about that yet. So they just come in and they just ask, okay, what do you have in terms of response AI? What do you have on offer? And if it's anything, then that's good, But it's not about do you have something, do you not have something, but does that also align with the customer's internal standard or internal? It needs to be a good match between both of your views on responsible AI and ethical AI, and what's a good standard of skilling that you want to have in terms of the partner who's doing it.
Yeah, I really like that, but especially linking back to, is on the ethical AI piece, does this align to our business values, and like what the behaviors that the AI is doing, is that aligning to that our own business values? And I've seen that a couple of points in a couple of the AI roundtables that we did, I think with Microsoft previously. That was one of the things that came out there. And I really like the bit that you had there around these, I guess, the questions and considerations before kind of approaching and discussing the vendors of these LLMs. What is this model based off? What is it learned from? Because I don't think people come with that kind of set knowledge. They just come with a use case and then they connect up. But how would you go about deciding? Obviously, there's so many different models now, and there's bigger ones that are coming out, and you always see the comparisons of the sizes with things like whales and an extra piece of rice or something. But when someone has a use case for AI, how would they kind of decide which one to use? Because one of the other bits that we're kind of discussing on a previous event was, sustainability of AI. Obviously these AI services cost more money for the bigger models, right? So, but then, you should be asking the question of, is this other AI service okay, or do we need the OpenAI models?
Yeah, absolutely. That's another principle that I wish we had as part of our principles. I think there was some discussion to have it added, but it's not been happening yet. In terms of responsibility, is also responsibility to the planet and the environment, and what's our stance on that? I'm not sure. I think it's something not enough customers are really looking into too much because it's hard to get any answers. There's not a lot of transparency with a lot of these AI model builders. So if you think about OpenAI, I've not seen a sustainability report on this is exactly how much it took to build this model. And every customer will have to start thinking about their own sustainability goals and their own emissions and where does it fit in. And if you think about maybe your emissions budget, so you might have set yourself a certain target that you don't go over X amount of carbon emissions. If you now start using OpenAI, one of the largest model for, I don't know, 10 use cases, you're really using it very heavily, you might easily exceed your carbon emissions budget that you set for yourself. And many people are not thinking about it. It's definitely something we should probably think about more. But that's why it's really good that smaller models are coming out. And I think they're going to gain popularity very, very soon. More and more people are trying to build smaller models. They're also cheaper to host. So it's benefits all around, I'd say.
Yeah, again, it's, I guess it's all dependent on use cases. It's but one of the things that we do as part of we've got a 5-step approach to kickstarting an AI project, and that we've built at Arreoblue, and some of those things are just really ideating and having a workshop around what is the use case, what are you trying to do, and what's the action that you're trying to do with this AI project, because do you need a Ferrari for when actually you can do with something much less?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not even choosing between the different LLM models. Sometimes it's as simple as, do you even need an LLM model? There's so many things that can be done with just a very simple algorithm or a cognitive service or other things that are already on the market. So just because right now it's the in thing to do you really need a large language model to begin with? That most likely took a lot of energy to get to the point where it is, and also a lot of energy to host it.
I think that's a brilliant point there. I think just as we kind of start to close off this episode, what are your thoughts in terms of the future? Where do you see this going? I guess not just AI, but obviously the responsible and ethical AI. I mean, we've mentioned some really interesting topics along the way in this journey. Having the right skills in place, people having the right policies and principles within their own business. I guess where do you see that kind of going in the future?
Yeah, last week I was at a very good conference called the AI for Good Summit in Geneva, and it was hosted by the UN and a bunch of regulators, bunch of AI UN partners. And what they discussed is how AI is evolving in the regulatory space and also how it's evolving in the research space. But I think more and more these conversations that we're having are going to be brought into the general public. And you can see it in the news and the media. Just about anyone is talking about AI. I saw an interview where Jennifer Lopez was talking about AI because of her latest movie. So I think the topic is definitely going to evolve. And as we take in more perspectives from the general public, I think it would be nice to hear how they think about it, because we think about it in terms of performance and cost and profit, and then regulators think about it in terms of risk, but there are not enough people thinking about the opportunities or how it affects certain demographics. One very good example from the summit was there were a lot of people from third world countries. So there's a big representation from African countries. And they were talking about how the languages that they're just speaking in don't really work well with large language models.
Yes.
And how we actually need a lot more language support for these big LLMs, and how this just doesn't work in certain markets. So there's so many different considerations that I think most people haven't thought about, and most big companies that operate in the US or the UK, which are predominantly English speaking, haven't thought about. So I think it's going to be evolving a lot, and it's going to take in different industries and different school of thoughts that weren't really involved in tech before.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and I love the kind of the view there as well of cultural AI and how that changes, just because AI from this country might respond in this way, but actually from a different culture will respond in a different way, as well as the kind of language barriers. But I managed to I didn't get to go to Geneva, but I caught the videos of that, so that it was really interesting. But Amazing. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions or?
No, I mean, it sounds really good what you're doing. What is your current ResponsePay offering? So in terms of to customers, do you just have an advisory offering on the processes, or do you also do like technical implementations on safeguarding?
Yeah, really good question there. Yeah, so we've obviously got the framework where we can provide advisory services on AI, but yeah, we've got as I mentioned, we've got a kind of 5-step process to actually quick starting your process, and then we also have our three A's, so RSS, Accelerate, and Amplify, which help customers get started with their AI projects as well. But yeah, the couple of different ways that we're helping customers on that side. But
that's cool. Yeah, it's definitely a gap in the market. Not enough partners have any offerings around this space, so it's nice to see that they're more being developed.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you again for joining us on the podcast today. We'll catch you on the next episode.